Hey everyone, Coach Joel here. And today we have video number 4 of this video. We're going to start talking about some basic probabilities of making certain hands. And it's essential to know these probabilities because how should you know whether you should play a hand pre-flop? Is it a good decision or is it not? And knowing these probabilities up front will help set your expectations about your own odds of winning so that you can decide whether it's worth investing money into the hand or not. So the first thing that's really important to know is it is hard to make a hand in Texas Hold'em. And a lot of strategy will revolve around this concept. And this is one of the reasons why we preach playing fewer hands than your opponents. You really don't want to be in a lot of pots with weak hands that have a weak chance of making bigger hands. You also don't want to set yourself up for disappointment. You're putting in a lot of money pre-flop, and then your hand falls short. You're in a field of many players, and you're consistently losing money. So a few things to know. Right up front, a pair versus two suited overcards. The pair is usually a slight favorite, but very slightly. Kind of depends on the pair. So a low pocket pair like pocket twos will actually be will be less of a favorite compared to a hand like ace king suited because twos can get counterfeited by the board. In other words, if the board comes 6-6-5-5, you now have too high with your pocket twos. So lower pairs aren't doing quite as well as the higher pairs against the two suited overcards. But still, a good rule to remember is that it's roughly a 50-50 coin flip. It's a race. These are the classic situations that often decide your tournament life. If you were to have the highest and the lowest card versus two unpaired cards in the middle. So in this example, say it's ace 10 versus king queen. You have the top and the bottom versus second and third. Usually that is roughly a 60-40 probability that the top and the bottom are going to beat the two cards in the middle. Again, some of these probabilities will shift depending on the specific cards, but these are really good rules of thumb to know up front. You have a general idea of how your hand is going to fare against your opponent's cards. And then we have pair versus one overcard and one undercard. So the pair will win 70% of the time, roughly, in the spot. So 30 people may be surprised that the losing hands are actually winning a decent amount of the time here. This is part of the variance in poker. So a hand like ace-5 suited still wins 30% of the time against pocket kings. It can be kind of a sobering fact. You're so excited to get pocket kings. It's the second best hand in all of Hold'em. And if somebody has a mere ace in their hand, they still have about a 30% chance of beating you if the ace is suited. So just things to keep in mind there for setting proper expectations. It's one of the reasons why hands that would have 30% equity could be good 3-bet bluffs because they retain equity. Equity meaning the chances of winning the hand by showdown. They retain that even against very strong holdings like pocket kings because they have that overcard. Then there are dominating hands versus dominated hands. So this is a bad spot to be in poker where, say, you have ace king and another player has ace queen. The ace queen is what's considered dominated because it's suffering from having a lower kicker. If the board comes ace high, the potential is there to lose a lot of money because you have top pair and a strong kicker, but you're still dominated. So in a lot of spots in poker, we will be talking about trouble hands. Ace queen is still a pretty strong hand. It only runs into ace king some of the time, but the trouble hands we'll want to discuss more are hands like king 10 off, queen 10 off, king jack offsuit, queen jack offsuit. These are the hands that a lot of the time when they make top pair, they could find themselves being second best. And the worst thing you can be in poker is second best because that's where you lose the most money. And right out of the gate, these hands are a 3-1 underdog, 75-25% up against the dominating hands. Then there's the bigger pair versus smaller pair conundrum. So this happens a lot of the time, and it's especially relevant in tournaments when all the money is going in pre-flop. The same thing happens in cash games, but there's less pre-flop all-ins. And in tournaments, you've seen this often on TV where somebody gets all in with aces and another player has kings, and it's very devastating because the player with kings now only has roughly a 20% chance of winning. It's actually a couple percent lower. But it's a good rule of thumb to know. And it will help you think, if you have a hand like queens and you think that your opponent's range is something like aces, kings, queens, or ace king, you can start to think to yourself, well, if he has these hands, I only have a 20% chance of winning. However, if he has overcards and I'm holding queens, then we're roughly a coin flip. So knowing this can help you make certain decisions based on the pot odds that you're getting. So we'll cover all of that, just kind of previewing the types of thinking you'll be doing once you know some of these really quick statistics on your chances of winning. And then continuing with this theme of it's hard to make a hand. So the chances of an unpaired hand pairing on the flop is only 32%. So if you have ace jack and the flop comes out, a lot of beginners are going to be disappointed. They had these great looking cards, and 2/3 of the time they're going to be left with just ace high on the flop. And it's a really important stat to know, again, for adjusting your expectations of what's going to happen pre-flop. And also, it plays a lot into continuation betting theory. So continuation betting is when you are the pre-flop raiser, another player calls, and you decide to bet the flop, whether it's as a bluff or it's as a value hand. And the reason why continuation betting is so effective is because A, you represented strength up front by raising pre-flop, and it looks like you're still showing strength on the flop, which can be hard to defend against. But B, your opponent will miss the flop about 2/3 of the time. And what continuation betting is doing is it's taking advantage of this fact that most players miss most boards. And especially if you're up against one player and you don't think he had a pocket pair pre-flop, and the board runs out in a certain way where it's unlikely he has flopped a big draw or a big hand, you can bet, you can make a continuation bet of 1/3 of the pot or even 1/2 of the pot. And your 1/2 the pot bet, it only needs to work 1/3 of the time for you to show a profit. Well, in this case, it might have even worked 2/3 of the time if your opponent is only playing post flop after the flop when he has a pair. So again, we see the unlikelihood of making strong hands with when we look at the chances of two suited cards making a flush by the river. A lot of players see suited cards and they're immediately enticed by these cards. They're excited. They want to make a flush with them. Even a flush draw will do. They can play aggressively with those. And the reality is they're only going to make a flush 6.25% of the time by the river. So it's an unlikely thing that they're going to hit their flush. Even when they hit their flush, some of the time they'll run into a bigger flush, or their opponents will clearly see that a flush has hit on the board and not pay them off. So these are all reasons for being selective about which suited cards we do decide to play, because we shouldn't really go into a hand with our only plan being that we should make a flush with this hand, because it's unlikely that we're going to make that flush. We see some of the similar things with connected cards. So two connected cards make a straight by the river 9% of the time. So a little bit more likely than a flush, but still unlikely. Still should not be playing necessarily any two connected cards. We really have to be gauging whether our position is good enough, how our hand fares against our opponent's range. We need to be taking into account more things than just my two cards are connected or my two cards are suited before we decide to play a hand. And then open-ended straight draws, you have just under a 32% chance of hitting a flopped open-ended straight draw by the river. So in other words, the three cards are dealt on the flop and you are holding 8-9 and the flop comes ace 6-7. And you think your opponent has an ace and you want to know what your odds are of getting there by the river. and it's going to be roughly 32%. And we need to be looking at the pot odds that we're getting to determine, is this hand worth chasing down or is it not? And then lastly, flush draws, same scenario. Say it's an ace-6-7 board with 2 clubs on the board, and you are holding 2 clubs in your hand. Say you have the queen and the 10 of clubs. You then have a 35% chance of making a flop flush draw by the river. So again, need to be weighing the pot odds, thinking about more factors than just your own hand. And doing this will just set proper expectations for, should I be in the hand in the beginning? Should I be playing this hand pre-flop? And then most importantly, you can start to think, well, if it's so hard to make a hand, maybe it's also hard for my opponent to have made a hand on this board. And knowing this kind of sets up this sometimes an elaborate game of chicken almost, where you know that what you're holding, but you also know that your opponent is unlikely to have one of these hands, that his hand is unlikely to have already become a made hand. And even if he has a draw, there's a good chance he'll miss by the end. So there's just a lot of pressure that you can apply using this concept of just it is hard to make a hand, and it's especially easy to do this if you're playing really good hands to begin with, so that you have an image of being a tight, disciplined player. And if you're coming into the hand for a raise and you're playing aggressively pre-flop, so this also adds to the image of, you're playing strong, you've represented strength, and it's going to be harder to call you down, especially as the odds are not in your opponent's favor for hitting all of these different things. So I hope you remember some of those probabilities. Later in this series, we're going to talk about 2 important rules, the rule of 2 and the rule of 4, that'll help you determine your odds on both the turn and the flop, for knowing not just with an open-ended straight draw and a flush draw, but with basically any hand that you're holding, what are your odds of making the desired hand by the river? So keeping all of this in mind, we are steering towards a tight, aggressive strategy. We are going to be playing disciplined pre-flop and staying out of the way of some of those trouble hands that can eventually be second best all too often in poker. So moving on to lesson 5, we will see you soon.